Paid Míle Fáilte to everyone, which, for those of you who don't know Irish, means 100,000 welcomes. You can see that word fáilte here in the image on the left in a Northern Irish monument erected to celebrate linguistic diversity. The middle stone is engraved in the Ugham alphabet, also associated with Celtic-speaking peoples. On the far left is an Ulster Scots translation. This variety is a legacy of what we call our plantation period. The colonisation of Ireland was, in fact, the first British experiment in how to move populations at scale onto Indigenous lands. The process changed its language ecology forever and created a new indigenised English. As so many of the contributions to this wonderful event show, the story of English since then is primarily one of disrupting language ecologies all over the rest of the world too. Tobias Bernaish's contribution to Monday's workshop, for example, referenced the impact of empire on the pragmatic nativization of Indian and Sri Lankan Englishes. Carly Bray advocated for applying decolonial research principles in CDA analysis of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and issues. It is this same lens through which I'll be viewing the history of English in Ireland. The image on the right conveys that notion of welcome in a mural I photographed in County Tyrone, but from a range of other languages, including Polish, Portuguese, and Tetum, a contact language of East Timor, formerly colonised by Portugal. It represents another perspective from which I'll explore Ireland's linguistic landscape as a product of migratory movements, both in the past and in the present. Ultimately, I want to use this address to shed further light on a debate which is central to our understanding of how World Englishes are to be defined and modelled. Here is my direction of travel. I'll begin by introducing the arguments surrounding colonial English models. I'll then document the colonial history of Ireland and see if we can use it to test the model's linguistic predictions. Issues surrounding colonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonisation defined here will be key. In an effort to decolonise, as Carly Bray argues that we should, I also want to unpack our understanding of colonialism and indeed post-colonial English, a definition and a critique of which I'll give you very shortly. New interdisciplinary research like hers, capturing insights from anthropology, sociology, and Indigenous scholars, provides compelling arguments to suggest that these terms need some serious unpacking. It becomes clearer that we ought to be distinguishing between different types of colonialism, as Veracini does. So he says, colonialism reinforces the distinction between colony and metropole. Settler colonialism erases it. Settler colonial systems don't actually rely on pre-colonial population as labourers, for example. Essentially, the goal of settler colonialism is to dissolve native societies, as Patrick Wolfe puts it. This is achieved by erasing the histories and geographies that provide the foundation for Indigenous and cultural identities and sense of self. Here's a painting of how an artist depicts that erasure arising from the medieval incursion of colonists to Ireland. The painting portrays the marriage of an Anglo-Norman knight to an Irish princess. Native erasure is depicted in the foreground of the painting, strewn with dead Irish warriors. The eradication of their culture is captured by the broken string harp, is captured by the broken string harp on the left, which endures as an Irish icon to this very day. Hence, as far as dissolution goes, this may give us pause for thought regarding the type of colonialism at issue, and which I'll test from a linguistic perspective later. The term post-colonial English, as you know, is synonymous with the seminal work of Edgar Schneider, an illustrious past president of IAL, who's done so much not only for the society, but for scholarship in the linguistics of English. His development of the dynamic model has paved the way for an approach which views new Englishes as developing along this single evolutionary pathway, consisting of these 5 phases with 4 parameters per phase. In essence, the model describes how 2 separate populations, the local indigenous, so IDG, strand and the external settler strand, contribute to these 5 phases in the development of post-colonial Englishes, from original foundation in a new place, where the language was never used before, bio-exonormative stabilization, nativization, and endonormative stabilization, through to the final phase of differentiation, in which the mature language splits into a range of subvarieties. The definition Schneider offers at the top of the slide specifically excludes British English. While his 2007 monograph does consider Irish and Irish English as diasporic varieties, Irish English and its relationship with the indigenous language to which it's related is also never considered. It is, however, implicated in the development of African, American, Australian, and Singaporean English. So, for example, here's an example from Bobda, where he argues that a wide range of African pronunciation features may have derived from the colonial dialect input rather than mother tongue interference. And his examples, for example, include Eastern Nigerian in nurse forms. And he argues that possibly these were transported by Irish and Scottish missionaries. Same kind of thing then if we look at work by Wolfram and Schilling Estes, which Schneider quotes. The special role of adstraits in American English is reflected by earlier borrowings from other contact languages. And of course, here he implicates Irish Gaelic, and he says that's been preserved by some of the Scottish and Irish immigrants and reported to have contributed lexical items like smithereens, for example, or shanty, as in the example here. There are 3 reasons why I think Schneider is missing a trick by not considering Irish English. First of all, because the Irish experiment proved to be a test case from which lessons were learned for subsequent British colonial experiments across the globe. Secondly, since we unusually have records of the emergent variety dating back to the Middle Ages, as such, we're offered a rare opportunity to reconstruct what the first ever colonial English might have sounded like, where it was used, and how it subsequently evolved across temporal and regional space. My third reason is because in their position paper, Dennis and Darcy argue that their proposed model is applicable to colonial contact situations in the more distant past. And I figured that this gauntlet was well worth picking up because I've spent so much of my career considering socio-historical cases of language contact, but had never before questioned in my own work the nature and history of distinct types of colonialism and what the implications were for the varieties of English that might evolve. Before I begin to sketch the evolution of Irish English in these terms, though, I wanted to pause and mention some of the drawbacks of the dynamic model because they're highly relevant to how I'll approach my own analysis. As Detterding in this review observes, there are substantial differences between 2 basic kinds of Englishes, citing those in North America, Australia, and New Zealand, which he then contrasts with other types developed in India, Nigeria, and Singapore, where indigenous language influences seem much more prominent. Dennis and Darcy push this caveat even further because they take a new interdisciplinary approach to account for these differences. At the heart of their thinking is establishing the case for a more nuanced view, which discriminates between so-called settler colonial Englishes, like those found here in Australia or North America, and post-colonial Englishes, like those of India or Singapore. They suggest that post-colonial Englishes is an inaccurate cover term, one that glosses over important ecological distinctions and places varieties on a continuum when they're better considered separate evolutionary contexts. Their more nuanced approach predicts that these ecological distinctions will have important linguistic ramifications because they entail the indigenous languages having different degrees of influence on the resulting variety. There are other distinguishing features that must be considered, for instance, whether or not the English's name is a glossonym for English varieties spoken by settlers, or instead incorporates the language of the region's indigenous groups. Likewise, it's important when assessing where World English fits in the colonial typology to determine whether or not there's widespread homogeneity or heterogeneity across the geographical space in which it is spoken. The linguistic manifestations of these ecological differences are summarized in Table 1. Truly post-colonial Englishes, like those of India and Singapore, have vocabularies which include basic or core lexes from Indigenous languages. In addition, there is good evidence for contact innovation at all levels of the grammar. The variety is known by a glossonym that reflects the ethnicity of the Indigenous rather than the settler population, and it also shows considerable heterogeneity. Before we can address which category Irish English belongs to, though, I need to sketch Ireland's settlement history. So let's have a go at that. The Anglo-Norman military incursion we saw depicted in MacLeise's painting led to the colonisation of lands formerly occupied by Indigenous Gaelic chieftains. So Eastern Ulster, so this would be in the map on the far left-hand side, and places like Leinster, so this would be the area of the Pale, for example, on the map on the right-hand side, were particular targets. They document settlement from the early 14th to the 17th centuries. However, contrary to what the painting may have seemed to signal, following this first incursion, extensive Irish monoglottism actually prevailed for many centuries afterwards. This was because of the extent to which the Norman colonizers eventually became assimilated to Gaelic norms rather than the other way around. Vestiges of their colonial legacy remain, though, and there are literary works, things like the Kildare poems illustrated here, alongside governmental, administrative, and ecclesiastical documents. So, for example, these would be some examples like the Armagh Asses in Registry, as well as things like the inscriptions of the Smarmore slates from County Louth, which is in the heart of that Pale area. That expression, by the way, beyond the Pale, dates to this period and is based on colonial narratives tied to ethnic stereotypes like these about the barbarous Indigenous population who dominated outside the Anglo-Norman garrison. So, for example, in their world, all our trees look like shamrocks and we spent our time going around knocking the head off each other with axes. And again, if you look at some of the texts from this period, you can see, for instance, that, from an ancient and wicked custom, they always carry an axe in their hands instead of a staff, that they may be ready promptly to execute whatever iniquity their minds suggest. This race is inconstant, changeable, wily, and cunning. So while within those kind of colonial fortresses of that Pale area, what does the linguistic evidence look like for deciding the type of colonies they were, using those kinds of criteria which Dennis and Darcy have laid out, who apply to much more recent context and certainly nothing from the Middle Ages? So let's start by having a look at those Smarmore slates again in a little bit more detail. They would include well-documented Middle English spellings with the Q graph for the Old English HW and contemporary WH digraphs in forms like QUHETMEL for wheatmeal and QHUAN for wen. There's also some evidence, as you can see here, for stereotypical Irish English pronunciations of voiceless alveolar stops as dentalized, captured in spellings such as ORA-THEL for Middle English double geminate spellings, ORA-TTEL. That lexeme, by the way, is conjectured to be the name of the plant, and the seeds of it kind of rattle in its pod if you shake it. Again, sticking with these slates, what's also interesting is that it contains the Irish phrase briscan lush, referring to the leaves of the silverweed herb. So you can see that on the third line down on that slate you see in the image. And that would seem to be one of the earliest indisputable examples of a contact effect from an Indigenous language in a colonial English. Of course, thinking back to Dennis and Darcy's summary table, this is not an element of basic vocabulary. While cases have been made by other scholars for grammatical contact innovations in the Kildare poems and other medieval Irish English documents, I've actually not encountered any in my analysis of those Armagh diocesan registry documents I showed you an image of just now. As such, I would caution against describing the variety, at least at this stage in its evolution, as anything other than a settler colonial English, as Veracini would define it. Taking this view also accommodates the fact, at least in those areas where the Anglo-Normans dominated, they did so in exactly the same manner ascribed to the settlement of Canada by Dennis and Darcy. In other words, they actively attempted to uproot and destroy the vitality and autonomy of Indigenous modes of life. By doing so, the possibilities for linguistic convergence in Schneider's terms between settler and Indigenous strands was severely limited. What is more, beyond the pale, Ireland didn't operate as a colony anyway, and eventually the metropole even lost its grip on the original Anglo-Norman settlers. At this time, Ireland effectively became an ex-colony in many respects, which cannot be said of contemporary America, Australia, Canada, or New Zealand, which steadfastly remained settler colonial without an obvious pathway to decolonisation. The dilemma faced by the metropole regarding this turn of events is abundantly clear, for example, from assimilationist and absorptionist policies and practices, like this ineffective medieval legislation enacted to de-Gaelicize those Anglo-Normans who had begun to acculturate. So, for example, high treason would be ascribed of you if you took a name after the Irish fashion, used the Irish language or dress or mode of riding without a saddle, adopted any other Irish customs, all your lands and houses would be forfeited. So that kind of same sense of trying to annihilate in that kind of way. The geographical proximity between Ireland and its nearest neighbour, which can be seen here in this 19th century satirical map, where Ireland is actually tethered to England, coupled with the empire building desires of Tudor and subsequent heads of state, meant that Ireland remained a sitting duck, though. They viewed the island not only as a test case for what might be achieved even further afield, but also as a cash cow with enviable resources of land and timber. This meant that further attempts to subjugate and exploit were inevitable. In fact, they became increasingly effective and expansive during the 17th century. You can see their success in this map, which contrasts land ownership amongst Roman Catholics, in other words, the indigenous or indigenized populations, between the mid-17th and early 18th centuries. So you can see, for example, that in the 1641, quite a lot of land was owned by Roman Catholics, and the Roman Catholics would have been either the indigenous population or the indigenized one, the kind of very early medieval settlement. But if you compare that then with the map in 1703, not that long later, you get actually, most of the land cover is only 0 to 24% Roman Catholic. Important to note, though, that these land grabs in and of themselves didn't wholly annihilate the Irish-speaking population. Moreover, while the medium of instruction in the 1830s colonial national schools was English, socio-historical research indicates that very few Indigenous children engaged, often preferring illegal hedge schools, still taught through the medium of Irish. Furthermore, there's no proof of forcibly removing them from their communities and families, such as has been found for 19th century Canada or, of course, Australia. What's more, there's excellent evidence for sustained monolingualism in Irish, as well as Irish-English bilingualism, well into the 20th century, in places like County Armagh in Northern Ireland, where I grew up. As you can see in figure 17 here, over 50% of the population in rural areas of the county, and these are shown here in red and blue, continued to be Irish-speaking in 1801. And that's a real contrast then with metropole-directed urban centres like Tyranny in green, where English already predominated even in the 1780s. It isn't hard either to find examples of efforts to maintain the type of distinction between colony and metropole, which Veracini argues to accompany colonialism, which is not of the settler colonial type, in which erasure was instead key. You can gather that from this Punch cartoon. It depicts members of the nationalist and Irish-speaking Young Irelander political party as treasonous apes. To the left of this image is an extract from the English-based weekly The Spectator about a murder case involving Irish monoglots from a place called Mam Trasna that I'm going to come back to shortly. So in The Spectator, for example, we're told that the existence in particular districts of Ireland of a class of peasants who are scarcely civilized beings and approach far nearer to savages than any other white man. And then going on to say, in remote places of Ireland, so this would be somewhere like Mantrasa, which is in Galway, dwell cultivators who are in knowledge, in habits, and in the discipline of life, no higher than Maoris or other Polynesians. So what do these colonial hierarchies, knowledge of the types of settler versus Indigenous contacts, the spatial distribution of local peoples, and the persistence of the Irish language mean for whether we define contemporary Irish English as a settler colonial or post-colonial variety? The only way we can answer that really is by applying those 4 litmus tests that Dennis and Darcy propose, which I've added here to remind you. Let's take a look at how far Ireland really is tucked underneath John Bull's octopus arm then. As far as Indigenous loanwords go, next slide, this observation by Umwiraila makes it clear that a very high proportion of toponyms are indeed based on Irish. And you can see that here. But then this is not unusual, even in settler colonial contexts like Australia, which if I go to this slide, we can have a look at. And it's apparent from the range of Aboriginal names of Brisbane suburbs that Watson derives from the Indigenous Turrbal language of Queensland. Here's a nice Irish example based on the place name where the murders I just mentioned took place. It's a compound that combines the Irish words for a mountain pass and a cross. Before we relegate this to evidence for Irish English being of the settler colonial type though, it's interesting to note that there's also an Irish English, oops, sorry, I've gone back a slide instead of forwards. So there's an Irish English word that's based on a semantic extension of Irish mam, which isn't a toponym, but actually is a unit of measurement. In fact, it's the amount of flour or sugar that fits into the palm of 2 cupped hands, which is actually really like the shape of the valley where Mam Trasna actually is in Galway. Before we go further with this though, I also wanted to show you that the other semantic domains which Dennis and Darcy argued to be indicative of settler colonial contact, namely flora, fauna, and natural environment, as well as lexemes based on cultural concepts, are also present in Irish English. So we've already seen the flora example in those medieval Smarmore slates. And there are lots more that have been identified for contemporary dialects, as you can see on this slide. And you can see, for example, the word drumlin. You can see why it's called a drumlin, because it relates to the Irish word for back, and that's kind of what it looks like. It's like an arched back. Irish English differs significantly and boasts a wide range of concepts relating to Gaelic cultural activities, just as Canadian English has toboggan from one of its Indigenous languages. And you might recognize these scallywags on one of those toboggans in Canada. And a really well-known example of that would be a women's hurling game that's being played here by my local Armagh team alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi. It is as equally death-defying as jousting with a lightsaber, but at least the Irish lassies insist on helmets and mouthguards. What's interesting, I think, and where Irish English differs significantly from Canadian English and more closely resembles Indian or Singaporean English, though, is the extent of core vocabulary transferred from Irish, as in this selection. So you can, a lot of people would continue to talk about, my husband is a Kithog, he's left-handed. And again, people would use that word smithereens, which Wolfram and Schilling Estes also mentioned as part and parcel of American English as a result of migration from Ireland. While these are very productive and widely used locally, they're actually clearly tricky for other people. So you can hear that in this clip that I'm going to play you shortly of Liz Truss, the former UK Foreign Secretary, having a go at the Irish word Taoiseach, while purportedly in conversation with Father Ted from a well-known Irish sitcom. I don't know if you know it, but it's kind of amusing. And it originally meant leader, chieftain, or ruler, but is now the term for the head of government in the Republic of Ireland. So let's have a listen to how Liz Truss gets on with Taoiseach.
So I would strongly encourage the Irish Taoiseach to discuss this with the EU. The Irish Taoiseach.
Sorry, didn't get it there either.
So a wide spectrum of semantic domains are in evidence, and unlike settler colonial varieties, Indigenous loanwords in Irish English aren't confined to the naming of places and things that are conceptually new or specific to the region, as seemed to be true for the medieval colonisation of the same territory. There's another pointed contrast between contemporary Irish English and settler colonial varieties. Of course, as you see here, several features of Irish English, like other colonial Englishes, can be reduced to vernacular universals of the type which Chambers has argued for. So like the alveolar substitution examples on the slide from my field work, which have actually become enregistered. So you can see that in this wall art on the bottom right. So Grandel stretch inda evening. Now, since post-colonial Englishes began their evolution as an L2, it isn't surprising either, as Dennis and Darcy observe, that they also have parallels with one another that are induced by the acquisition process itself, including the stopping of interdental fricatives to alveolar t or d. There's good evidence of that in Irish English in this example of brother for brother from P.L. Henry's fieldwork. And it's widespread, and it's actually played on by the title of this comedian series about learning Irish as a second language. Fada, by the way, is the word for length mark in Irish, and it also captures local English pronunciations of brother and father, with those kind of dentalized alveolar stops instead of fricatives. In order to qualify for post-colonial status in Dennis and Darcy's terms, though, we need to demonstrate that Irish is also the source of transfers into Irish English at different levels of the grammar, including its phonology, morphosyntax, and discourse pragmatics. So what kind of evidence can we find for that? Well, in fact, the spectacles here aren't quite as rose-coloured as you might have expected, so we need to proceed with caution. So, for instance, Roger Lass argues that Irish English is not a contact English and shows only marginal contact effects. The implication here, therefore, is that Irish English should be viewed as a settler English, more in line with the Australian context. Kingsmore's position, however, gets closer and much closer to that qualitative difference that would put Irish English firmly in the post-colonial camp. She views Irish Gaelic as influencing all Ulster speech as a result of contact between the settler and Indigenous strands, leading to linguistic convergence of exactly the right type. My own view is that the waters are muddied because researchers rarely take the right kind of multifactorial and interdisciplinary approach required. This is how I put it in my 2010 book. Before any claim can be made about the origins of a particular structural feature or the manner in which it's been learned, it's crucial to establish a number of facts about the contact situation. For example, the history and geographical sources of the languages spoken. Okay, so Let's see how this orientation works out in practice, beginning with L1 phonological transfers. As you can see from the caveats also expressed in this quotation from Maguire's work on the source of Mid-Ulster English palatal alveolars, some of the issues he raises echo my approach. He argues that the dynamics of the feature may resemble transfer because there are phonetic similarities between Mid-Ulster English and Ulster Irish. However, the parallels are not crystal clear, nor is the extent to which Irish English is wholly dissimilar from other common or garden Englishes. Caveats aside, though, what does the actual evidence look like? Let's start with the feature which Maguire describes as probably the most well-known marker of Irish English segmental phonology. It's the use of dentalized stops in all positions where other Englishes more typically use dental fricatives. In fact, this preference is so stereotypical that it too has been enregistered and then commodified, as in this postcard here of doze, dozy monks. Could this be evidence for contact-induced phonological change? Scholars like McManus, who Maguire cites here, have shown that by the 13th century, Old Irish had actually replaced the dental fricatives attested earlier. As such, their absence could have caused a problem for an L1 Irish speaker trying to construct for themselves a new Irish English phonemic inventory. The argument would therefore be that during acquisition, Indigenous L2 learners innovated by simply matching the place of articulation of the English fricatives, in other words, as dentalized, even if they didn't adopt their manner of articulation, substituting dentalized stops to replace them. This could indeed then constitute an innovation caused by transfer, as Maguire seems to suggest here. Using the method that Maguire and me advocate doesn't make life easy, of course, because it can be tricky to discriminate between confounding factors, and researchers don't always have access to the relevant historical linguistic evidence. Nevertheless, this approach has allowed for the identification of several other consonantal features, which may be due, at least partially, to transfer effects from the Indigenous language, as illustrated from Maguire's summary in Table 2 here. So, for example, if we have a look at epenthesis, which is the kind of classic Irish English film pronunciation of film, or palatal velarization, so pronouncing Egypt, which is our version of idiot, as egit, for example. So lots of evidence, at least on the phonological side. So what evidence might there be in Irish English morphosyntax of Indigenous language transfer, which would likewise make this World English align more with Indian and Singaporean Englishes rather than settler Englishes? In a paper in which Labov himself wrangles with what he refers to as the mysteries of the substrate, he argues that Hiberno English is a model example of innovative L1 transfer. In support of his view that even an amateur could figure out this about Irish English, he cites the hot news perfect in example 3. The construction is restricted to Irish English, as you can see here. Also English in Scotland, which you can see in this example. Because it's been in contact with Scots Gaelic, as well as varieties like Labrador and Newfoundland, where Sandra Clark has demonstrated that the Irish settled intensively. So how productive is it in varieties of Irish English, and where does it come from exactly? Here are some examples from a South Armagh corpus that I compiled during my PhD. Here. Jeff Callan has also investigated its dynamics in Dublin English, where it operates similarly. The construction is clearly made of English material, in other words, a part of the verb to be, followed by after, and then a progressive form. We call it the hot news perfect because it conveys an aspectual distinction not found in other World Englishes that I'm aware of, which discriminates grammatically between the very recent past, hence the idea of hot news, and other forms of the perfect with have, for which the element of recency would have to be conveyed by the insertion of something like just, for instance. So something like one of the farls had just broken. In fact, it is indeed a calque on this construction, illustrated in 13 through to 15. Scholars of modern Irish define it as the active perfective aspect, although you can gather from the quote at the end of the slide from O'Sheagall that there's regional variation regarding which form of after is preferred. So Taresh would be in the south of Ireland and also in the west, but Inye would have been what I would use because I'm a speaker of Ulster Irish. The same temporal meaning is intended as in the contact English examples we already looked at. In other words, immediate past relevant to the time of utterance. So this is how the structure operates in modern Irish. Was such a feature also available, though, in the historical dialects of Irish, which would have been L1s for the first L2 speakers of Irish English in colonial times? The 5 stages conjectured for the construction's development are listed here alongside historical examples from spoken Irish. In Old Irish, ear, meaning after, a verbal noun introduced non-finite adverbial clauses of time. In early modern English, this structure had retrospective and prospective uses, in other words, past and future reference. The after perfect of Irish was a feature of spoken early modern Irish then, and 16 and 17 below evidence that. Phonetic reduction of ear, this kind of after form, to R then occurred, as in example 16, making it homophonous with the preposition er, meaning on. To avoid homophony, by the 18th century, er, for after, was thus replaced by taresh or inye, both of course also mean after. This scenario does clinch the argument then that a construction of this type was indeed productive in the L1s of the first acquirers of L2 English at the right time and place. There's considerable previous research indicating a wide range of other such contact effects that I won't rehearse, but are summarised here. Table 3 suggests that Irish English is indeed mirroring the kinds of morphosyntactic contact innovations that direct Dennis and Darcy to argue that Indian and Singaporean Englishes are not settler Englishes. Another string to their bow in this regard is the fact that each of these world Englishes exhibit unique sets of pragmatic markers traceable to transfer from Indigenous languages. So how does discourse pragmatic marking operate in Irish English? And do speakers use pragmatic markers that can likewise be attributed to the Indigenous language? The work cited here draws on both contemporary and historical Irish English data to determine whether a wide range of pragmatic markers are traceable to Irish or to colonial English and Scots. I found that these ones especially seem to be irrefutably connected with the forms and functions of pragmatic markers used in historical Irish. You can see this in 18 for a home, a distinctive pragmatic marker indicating sorrow found in this extract from a 17th century writer. Although there isn't time to go into further detail, the nature and extent of contact effects seem to go well beyond what is documented for settler Englishes. There's one other aspect of discourse pragmatic marking that I wanted to mention, because it likewise suggests that Irish English is qualitatively different to settler Englishes. It revolves around how like is used as a pragmatic marker, which is in fact subject to metalinguistic commentary, such as that offered in 19 by Kate Prince during the fieldwork for my 2010 book. So she says, I always think of people here, saying like after every sentence. It's also stereotypical enough to have been exploited by Coca-Cola in this strap line, the Coke side of Belfast like. And Kate herself did in fact go on to produce several of these, so 20 is an example of one of her own in the free speech part of the interview. There are 2 aspects of the historical development and geographical spread of this pragmatic marker that I wanted to highlight from Darcy's seminal work. Multifunctional like operated for most of Britain's colonial period, from the colonisation of the Americas to subsequent waves of emigration to the imperial expansion across the Pacific into the Southern Hemisphere. While many of you will be familiar with the considerable research effort already expended on discourse like in a range of undisputed settler colonial Englishes, close marginal uses of this particular pragmatic marker, especially in utterance final position, do indeed seem to typify Irish English above all others, as Darcy argues, ascribing it to the variety here. This finding has led to it being viewed as emblematic or stereotypical of Irish identity. And local speech, as the various authors cited here propose, so Chloe Diskin suggests that it's robust in the dialect, while Martin Schweinberger, one of our amazing conference organisers, similarly notes its saliency, frequency, and pervasiveness. This was why Chloe was then keen to examine whether recent immigrants to the Republic of Ireland had mastered its complexities in the local dialect. What she instead found was that while like in clause initial or clause medial position had been adopted relatively unproblematically by the non-native speakers, their adoption of clause final like appeared to be inhibited. And with that outcome in mind, Chloe and me did some further research on the variable using the comparative sociolinguistic method. The findings led us to argue that, as Darcy also contends, like was undoubtedly available in the speech of the English and Scots colonists who began settling Ireland in the Middle Ages. However, its particular frequency amongst Indigenous speakers of Irish English, especially in clause marginal positions, by comparison to settler colonial varieties like Australian English, may well be another transfer effect. We suggested that this may be because of the propensity for a wide range of discourse markers in Irish to occupy clause peripheral rather than medial positions, such as och, and of course it's Irish English calc but, just exactly as they do in 21A and 21B on the slide there. Clause final och in 22 now, and this is from O'Sheaghall's Irish Grammar, is very similar, for example, to the function of but in 21B, which you can see again here. Of course, as we know from the inspiring work of scholars like Jean Mulder and Sandra Thompson, this particular pragmatic marker has now become stereotypical of Australian English too, and is likely a contribution made to this variety by Irish English speakers historically. The main focus of my collaborative research with Chloe, though, was to examine the adoption of discourse like by newcomers to different locations on the island, with comparator samples drawn from local speakers. One of the sites was Dublin, a major conurbation in the Republic of Ireland, while the other was the more modest urban settlement of Armagh in Northern Ireland. And here are our research questions. So, do L2 speakers differ in their rates of discourse like usage compared to locals? Is like usage amongst local and L2 speakers bound by the same internal constraints, things like clause of position? So here's some of the findings that we got. Let's hone in first of all on the contrast between preferences for clause medial, highlighted in blue, and clause final in red across all ethnic groups in both cities. As you can see, clause internal like is favoured in both locations by newcomers. By contrast, across both locales, the Indigenous participants preferred like clause finally. The divergence between Armagh and Dublin locals may reflect the different periods when Irish declined in each city, with the shift in Dublin's Pale region happening considerably earlier. As such, Armagh speakers may retain clause final like because their ancestors L1 reinforced the preference for clause marginal discourse marking. By comparison, the shift to English in Dublin's Pale began in the Middle Ages, when the discourse marker function of like was completely unattested. Since most regions of Ireland outside of the large cities shifted to English around the later period conjectured for Armagh, the feature has come to be regarded as stereotypical for Irish English more broadly and is one that is subject to social comment, as we've already seen. Armagh speakers may be exhibiting a preference for local traditional clause marginal like, rather than more urban and clause medial type. It's interesting to note the opposite tendency amongst their migrant peers who prefer clause medial feel like, and do so perhaps because they're more oriented to current global trends in Ireland. Capitals like Dublin generally have higher migrant populations, are composed of more fluid social networks, and have better global connections. It's therefore not difficult to imagine that a migrant to a small city like Armagh may be less inclined to participate in local practices, especially when they're indexical of the host community to which the newcomer may not want to orient, and instead they much prefer orienting to more fluid cosmopolitan trends. Indeed, there was some evidence of just this orientation amongst the Armagh newcomers who I interviewed. Many of them appeared to have loose local ties and spoke of plans to return home or to follow relatives to a different migrant destination. This type of stepwise migration pattern isn't unusual, as I found out from conversations with the Singha sisters, who are of Indian heritage. I'll play a little recording of theirs shortly, and how they're describing their stepwise migration journey before arriving in Armagh. Both siblings were born in Trivandrum in South India's Kerala state. The oldest sibling, Ciara, migrated internally over 1,000 kilometers away to Mumbai in the state of Maharashtra in the care of an aunt. The youngest one, Shukla, migrated transnationally with their parents even further to Saudi Arabia before the family were eventually reunited in the UK 9 years prior to my interview with them. And then they moved to Armagh 5 years later. So here's what she says.
Yeah, but we've been in UK for more than 9 years.
So tell me the history, the story of your lives.
Well, she was in a different place, I was in a different place because she was with my parents in Saudi Arabia. Well, you were in Saudi Arabia from a very young age.
And so where were you?
I was with my dad's sister who was in Mumbai.
Okay.
Yeah, so we were in 2 different places. Yeah, and then we came over here as a family, yeah.
And again.
Yeah, but we've been in UK for more than 9 years. No, we don't really care because I don't think we'll be staying here for the rest of our lives. So I think we'll be moving to different countries because I don't prefer like I would rather move to a different country after like qualification after my uni and everything.
So that's in response to my asking her if she felt it was important to develop a Northern Irish accent in order to integrate locally. And this view clearly indicates that she aspires to continue with her stepwise migratory lifestyle. This inclination may make her reluctant, like her Polish and Lithuanian peers in the same city, or those of Chinese and Polish extraction in Dublin, to develop stereotypical Irish English features which have been inherited from the Indigenous language and could require jettisoning at some point in their futures. Ciara's mutable identity mirrors the designation of the national variety associated with Ireland, an important factor for deciding post-colonial status in Dennis and Darcy's terms. Examining these extracts written several years apart, the labelling of this particular World English has been controversial. So P.L. Henry prefers Anglo-Irish and denigrates Declan Kybert's use of Hiberno English, while Ray Hickey uses Irish English, so 3 labels to date. But from the perspective of glossonyms, it is significant to note that each of them reference the English spoken by an Indigenous people associated with Hibernia, which is of course the Latin term for Ireland. In that sense then, Hickey's comment here is wide of the mark when considered in the light of new scholarship, because both Australian and Canadian English as settler strands would be classified as demolects, whereas Irish English as an ethnolect does meet another of Darcy and Dennis's criteria for post-colonial status. The final linguistic factor that Dennis and Darcy consider is the extent to which varieties of English within colonial settings are not homogeneous. So they say we're concerned with the variation that emerges as a consequence of contact between English and distinct languages of dominant Indigenous populations within and across a socio-political entity. I've already demonstrated that diverse ethno-linguistic immigrant groups differ regarding the extent to which they participate in clause final like marking that is emblematic of the local baseline variety. It was also clear from these data that differences like this are both geographic and ethnographic. Other research I've undertaken focusing on how newcomers handle quotatives has shown that this is another context of potential contact and heterogeneity, supporting the case for Irish English being a post-colonial variety. To what extent are the varieties used by the Indigenous communities north and south of the Irish border also heterogeneous though? Is there evidence, as Dennis and Darcy argue, for the development of unique indigenised varieties across geographic space, differing from one another on the basis of the dominant local languages spoken in different regions? Schneider has already made this case for Marathi, Hindustani, and Kannada Englishes as distinct indigenised varieties. In fact, Donald Winford has already done the spade work for me here, finding that Irish English is indeed an indigenised English of the British Isles, alongside the other Celtic Englishes. Sorry, I've gone too far. Let me go back. Expressing surprise, so this is Donald Wilford, expressing surprise that they're not usually included as a new colonial English, since in his view, they clearly form part of this category. Now, there isn't space to address his evidence. However, it is abundantly clear, if you're lucky enough to co-edit with your Next Isle president, Bernd Kortman, the following scholarly works on these indigenised varieties across the British Isles. I hope you would agree that reading these dispels any doubt you might have that Celtic Englishes are in any sense homogenous. So to wrap up then, here are some final thoughts on where this decolonising discussion of language, migration and identity on the island of Ireland has got us to in terms of the important ecological distinctions that I've uncovered across time and space. In the first place, it does seem possible to apply the new model of colonial Englishes advocated by Dennis and Darcy to contact situations in the more distant past. The settlement type and linguistic ecology in which medieval Irish English evolved has proved to be rather different to the impacts of subsequent colonising efforts by the British. The latter have reinforced cultural and linguistic distinctions between colony and metropole, while the military incursions of the Middle Ages sought to erase them with their Pale-type fortifications. There were, however, opportunities for the varieties spoken by later colonists and the Indigenous population to converge as they co-constructed a new indigenised English via processes of language acquisition, transfer, and dialect mixing. Although both the medieval, settler English and later modern post-colonial English evolved on the same island, they ought not to be considered as following an identical trajectory on Schneider's continuum and are better regarded as two separate evolutionary contexts. This dichotomy is exactly what the linguistic evidence I've shown you predicts and continues to the further refinement of how we model world Englishes. The elephant in the room, of course, is that the important socio-political forces which shaped the post-colonial language ecology of Ireland that I've argued for have been exerted in different ways across the island over time and space. The Republic of Ireland to the south has the kind of strong sense of self-determination which Schneider would argue to be typical of the exonormative and differentiation phases of his model. Political and social ties with Britain were severed when it materialised as a new independent nation, the so-called Irish Free State in 1922. Northern Ireland, by contrast, which itself emerged after partition, but remained within the UK, is thus atypical of what one might consider a post-colonial state to be. As Weston puts it, Northern Ireland contributes yet further to the proliferation of possible outcomes that may occur as a result of colonial influence. There remain persistent deep divisions between the Indigenous, Roman Catholic, and settler Protestant strands. The latter, for example, remain metropole directed in Veracini's terms on account of their unionist leanings. There's been some research in this area, most notably by Kevin McCafferty and the Milroys before that. However, the jury remains out with respect to whether these socio-political differences are reproduced as parallel ethno-linguistic divisions and what implications this may have for Northern Irish English and how it has evolved from the perspective of the models I've been interrogating. So if you like, there's my gauntlet for the next phase of this research. And I'm really looking forward to hearing if you have any questions about what I've presented today.